and very excited to hear about this.
Well,
so,
hopefully it stands up to scrutiny. So, hello, good afternoon. I recognize I'm like the third talk between lunch and coffee, and it's gotten quite warm in here, or I just feel a bit warm getting ready for a talk. So I will try to keep it somewhat dynamic. We're going to be moving along at a fairly brisk pace. As an American living in the UK, I slowly get quieter over time, but I don't speak any slower over time. So I will try and check my pace as I go. So this group is probably very familiar with lots of Shodan work, right? Since for the last decade, really, people have been talking a lot about Shodan. At most conferences, somebody brings it up in one way or another. And this is not going to be a talk like that, but I am going to cite 3 people who I think have done some fairly fundamental work with Shodan. So the first was Aaron Leverett, that this conference knows fairly well. In 2011, he was really the first to systematically look at Shodan and demonstrate that there's a bunch of internet-connected industrial control systems. And he makes a statement that this could be used to carry out attacks. So it's a possibility that there could be some attacks. Project Shine, a couple of years later, really brings this to the attention of the US government, I think, for the first time. And they make a similar statement. There's a possibility that someone with criminal intent could make use of all of these devices connected to the internet. And then 2 years later, you have the team from Michigan who develops the ZMap and ZGrab tool and eventually spins out Census. They find like a 400% increase in devices. That's probably because they were looking differently. But in any case, we're up to 60,000 devices now. And they say basically this whole domain is in disarray. So very broad and sweeping statement. But then they say, actually, we've also had this honeypot network connected for a long time. And we have seen 0 instances of any malicious attempt to modify ICS behavior via an ICS protocol. So it's an area in disarray, but very little interest. And so that sort of raises the question, what is the actual risk? We keep talking about internet-connected industrial control systems. There have been several excellent talks over the last 2 days about Industry 4.0 and the increased connectivity of devices. And yet we don't seem to really be able to demonstrate either the likelihood or the common case consequence that would show that there's a real risk, that there is an adversary who's interested in this population of devices. Now, some caveats. In this particular talk, I'm interested in devices directly connected to the internet. So I'm well aware that there are lots of demonstrated attacks using workstations or other Windows-based infrastructure. And so we've heard about Triton and Trisis, which is an example of that, or where the Windows-based infrastructure around an industrial system has been attacked in some way that prevents you from using your industrial systems, but the industrial systems themselves haven't been attacked. So that's like Hydro, for example. So I'm primarily interested in just that group at the top. The second clarification that's important to make early is that I am interested in the lower level adversaries, right? So this conference largely focuses in the top right corner. That's where, as security researchers, we like to be. It's interesting, it's creative, you're finding problems and solutions. Whereas most of the stuff that happens here at the bottom, these people who are sort of indiscriminate attackers just looking for low-hanging fruit, most of the time, they're just exploiting something that we already found a problem with, right? This is an implementation problem, not a new creativity problem, and so we don't like to spend a lot of time there. But as a population grows, this domain becomes more important. So take IoT as a great example of that, right? Sort of the bespoke attacks against IoT are not super interesting. What's interesting within the IoT environment are large botnets, cryptojacking, and things like that. But what I think connects most of this conference with this community of people down here is that resources, knowledge, and tools have a tendency to move down and to the left. And we're going to see a couple of examples of that here. So to have a large-scale and indiscriminate attack against an internet-connected population, you need first, a vulnerable population, which is large enough to be attractive. You need an adversarial community that has sufficient resources and tools and knowledge to attack that domain. And then you need some kind of economic incentive. Now, this doesn't have to be money. It could be prestige. It could be something that's ideological, but something that moves that cost-benefit proposition such that this community decides that this population of devices is worth attacking. Now, this isn't necessarily an orthogonal framework that I've developed here, but it is helpful when you apply it to different types of attacks to see why a particular population does get attacked and why a population doesn't. So we'll hit a couple of examples here. Conficker. I love Conficker because it's been around for 10 years, and there are still 500,000 devices connected to the internet. that are infected. That's an enormous number. So after 10 years, you still have a larger population of Conficker devices connected to the internet than the Mirai botnet has ever touched. And that is really demonstrating the third point up here, which is if you're going to attack a population, it has to be slow to patch. You don't want your vulnerability that you're exploiting to be fixed in the next update that everyone is going to get. So even if the update's available, if the population is slow to patch, then you have a really good target population. And this should be sounding like some of the things we've been hearing over the last couple of days about ICS. Mirai, of course, is an excellent example here of something that spreads very quickly and has been in the population for a long time. It's a bit suspicious that it checks all of my boxes, so feel free to provide feedback on that. But the one that I want to bring up here is within the tools and resources section. So Mirai, if you remember, the source code for Mirai was dropped on hack forums in 2016. So somebody who really understood something about Linux kernels, understood something about scanning, understood some basics about default logins, created quite a clever and very efficient tool, and then handed it to a whole bunch of people who didn't know what they were doing. And shortly thereafter, we had the largest distributed denial of service attacks that the internet has ever seen, perpetrated by people who were not capable of doing that by themselves. And you have several other examples of this. So HD Decryptor is a ransomware that uses a very powerful open source disk encryption tool. We've heard about NotPetya and WannaCry, and even if these are primarily disruption and not ransomware, they make very effective use of tools that somebody else developed so that somebody is able to, basically somebody develops that tool for a very targeted knowledge-based population. It gets dropped into a different environment and then exposes a very large population of internet-connected devices. And we could do a similar type of analysis for other large-scale attacks, so like UDP reflection attacks. And you can even start applying this to some of the more targeted attacks that we've been talking about over the last couple of days and see why you only get specific populations which get targeted and not more general populations. So the obvious question that I want to address at this point is, why are these devices connected to the internet in the first place? It's normally the first objection. You know, I start talking about this and somebody's like, you shouldn't ever connect these devices to the internet. And that is absolutely true. And I have no problem saying that. The problem is you have like 100,000 devices at this point that are connected. So similar to when like Reed and Jimmy yesterday were saying that they go to a PLC vendor and they say, hey, we've got this vulnerability to disclose. And they're like, well, we don't consider that a vulnerability because that's not how you should use the device. Well, that's an inadequate answer to demonstrating a problem. People are using the devices this way. It's a real problem for us. And so the question is why? Why do they keep connecting to the internet? Why does this population seem to continue to grow? There's a couple of decades of usable security and security economics literature that I think discusses this quite well, probably justifies its own presentation, and I'm going to sort of condense some of it here. Where I'm going to start is the vendor guidance. So if you go to most of the like hardening guides or the security guidance, and you go to the first page, you see three things. One, don't connect to the internet. Two, use role-based access control and strong passwords. Three, segment, 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 which is something that Nicholas also said in the SCADA Apocalypse presentation earlier this morning, which I'm going to leverage later in my talk here, hopefully, if I can riff on it well. Now, this is great guidance. Like, there isn't necessarily a problem with this, but it creates an issue for particularly your small to medium-sized businesses that have very narrow profit margins and also don't want to or don't have the expertise to pay people to do their security correctly and are trying to implement automation one device at a time. They don't hire somebody and say, hey, can you automate my whole factory? They say, we're installing a new pump, and we'd really like to make it slightly more efficient than our last pump. Can we have a slightly smarter device than what we got last time? So I would say the big picture issues that we have with this guidance, on the usable security front, you can't hand somebody a device or sell it to them and say, hey, welcome to the digital manufacturing revolution. Don't connect your device to the internet. The whole reason why they're doing it is because they think they can get some profit margin or they become more competitive against some other person because they can connect their device in some way. The other issue from a usable security perspective is I've yet to see a web server configuration manual that tells you that as soon as you've connected your Ethernet port to configure that web server, you've also exposed your ICS protocol port. And in almost all cases, the protocol port, like 102 for S7COM or 44818 for CIP or 47808 for BACnet, are default open. And when you connect to the web server, that port is connected as well. Now, from an economic standpoint, I want to bring up an example associated with segmentation. And this comes from a manual that I actually really like. It's a hardening guide, and it's a bit of an eye chart, but it shows basically a segmented network down here connected to a business network. And I added this after the SCADA apocalypse conversation earlier, where we talked about segmenting a network. So in this case, there are 9 PLCs actually connected to a physical process. According to this guide, you should buy 7 security products in order to connect these 9 things to the internet. And imagine if you're the vendor that just has one thing, right? Like I just bought one thing from this company. There are 3 different security appliances that you buy specifically to connect this device to the internet. Now, I'm cherry picking a little bit because obviously many of these devices have other functions, but according to this security guide, that's what they're for. So if I go back here, I would say that the reason why we're connecting these devices to the internet is, first, there are people who don't know they're being connected to the internet. Second, you can't sell somebody a device and tell them not to connect it to the internet if that was the whole reason why they bought it. So it just doesn't meet users' expectations. And then the third is we've established a high cost in both money and expertise in order to secure these devices without demonstrating a common case consequence. Most of these small businesses don't expect to be in Hedro's position. They don't expect to be the target of a nation-state attack. Most of them are hearing things like, well, your device isn't actually sufficiently resourced for any kind of crypto mining. You don't have anything on that device that anybody would care to encrypt because you don't maintain any IP on those devices. And frankly, if you have a botnet that's sending spam to somebody else, you don't care. That's called a side effect within economics. And it creates a problem in telling people who own a device that they need to secure their device when somebody else receives the consequence of an infection on that device. So we're not moving the cost-benefit proposition in any way that's helpful to encourage people to secure their devices. All right, so I told you that this wasn't going to be just another project looking at Shodan, but we did want to use Shodan and Census to try and understand the way users are behaving. So now we feel like I have a good handle on why users are connecting their devices to the internet. Once they've connected their devices to the internet, how do they behave? And so instead of taking individual snapshots, we wanted to look longitudinally. And we're able to pull about 4 years of data from both Census and Shodan. And the first thing you need to do if you have a lot of data and you're trying to track user behavior is track devices. So we needed to find some kind of passive fingerprint in this data. Thankfully, most devices give you some, if it's not a field bus protocol, it gives you some high-level, high-entropy piece of information that turns out to be globally unique. So lots of devices have a serial number, and if it's not a Conpot Honeypot, it tends to be unique. Or they have a user-defined data field, like an address. I'm not sure why people put their physical addresses into their devices. They're clearly asked for it on setup. But that also tends to be globally unique. That's the point of an address, I guess. And so we are able to track over 80% of the devices from vendors that aren't running a field bus protocol. So things like S7Com, CIP, BACnet, Niagara Fox, things like that. So we're tracking a lot of devices over this 4-year period. And we find, conveniently, if you're looking to attack some devices, that over 60% of these devices are connected for more than a year. 25% were connected at the beginning of our survey, so well over 3 years. So it's a very stable population. They tend to stay at the same IP address. So this makes sense if you're trying to find your own device, right? It's not very useful to have an internet-connected device that you can't find. But it also means that possibly these businesses are slightly larger than we had originally expected, right? Small residential units or very small businesses tend to have, they're connecting to an ISP. There's going to be some amount of DHCP churn, and we don't see any of that here. Firmware is where things get kind of fun and interesting. So most of these devices report firmware. I think you can see that well enough. So this is firmware for a particular type of device over about a 4-year period. And you can see some really nice things. One, there is a little bit of patching happening, which is really encouraging, right? You see this decreasing trend roughly proportional with an increasing trend. The problem is that software, which is 3 years old, here's all the new software down here. And what I like to show about this is these are devices that were only released a year ago. So this is not a legacy problem. These are brand new devices with the newest firmware that are being directly connected to the internet. This, interestingly, is not a problem for all manufacturers, but only some. So for example, Siemens appears to be getting better at this. I don't find as many new devices being connected to the internet as some other manufacturers, where actually the rate of increase appears to be going up. So there's an acceleration of connectivity, presumably because they're releasing more connectable devices. So going back to our usability statement, if we continue to provide this domain, more and more devices that you can connect, we're demonstrating basically that people will connect those devices. And finally, we just wanted to make sure that these weren't a few people with really bad cyber hygiene and lots of devices. So we did sort of a geographic study and demonstrated that we have a pretty diverse geographic population of devices that we're looking at. So if we go back to our framework, we check a lot of boxes, right? We have a large population, 100,000 devices. They stay online for a very long time. Very few of them are patching, right? So 23% was our best case over a 4-year period. Everyone else was worse than that. And then I checked the known vulnerabilities box, mainly because if you connect your unencrypted, unauthenticated industrial protocol port to the internet, you don't really need a vulnerability. You just need to be able to craft a packet. So then the question is, are people actually attacking any of these devices? And the anecdotal evidence was no, right? If we go all the way back to the census study in 2016, the honeypots basically are not seeing any interest. So maybe I'm trying to prove a negative here, which is kind of hard. So we tried to approach this problem from multiple technical angles, but then also from a sociological angle, looking at some hack forums themselves. And I'm going to walk through the first 3 fairly quickly, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about hack forums, since that's slightly different than what a lot of the other presentations here have been on. So at least within academic literature, all honeypot studies to date have demonstrated no interference with the devices from an ICS standpoint. And there appear to be 2 reasons for that. One is you either have low interaction honeypots that are connected for a long time but easy to fingerprint. So Shodan tells you that it's a honeypot, which is not very useful. Or you have a very high interaction honeypot where you've basically connected a real device to the internet. But that's expensive and difficult to distribute globally and hard to connect for a long time. So we worked with Securiot. So many of you know Michael is, I assume he's downstairs running. Oh, hey, all right. Thanks. All right. Well, so we worked with Securiot. We got some data from them. They run about 120 honeypots in 22 countries. And they gave us about a year's worth of data, and we were trying to pull some more out of them. But we found 200,000 stateful interactions. These are not SYN scans. These are actually somebody interacting with the device. Still mostly scanners. But interestingly, we do get 25 hits of like legitimate attempts to manipulate the device through an industrial protocol, which in itself is interesting because it means that there are some people with some targeted interest, some skill, and some resources who are convinced that this is a real device. Or they think it's sufficiently real that they're basically using it to test in order to do something else. So there's a couple possible explanations there. But it means that some people are interacting with these devices, and kind of that's an interesting result in itself. But from our standpoint, it shows that we really don't see any kind of large-scale attempt to manipulate these devices. This is the most geographically distributed, longest honeypot study, at least that I know of in the academic literature, and we still see no attempt to manipulate at scale, although we've demonstrated that they are sufficiently deceptive that some people are trying to interact with them. So the next thing we look at is Mirai. Now, why Mirai? Mirai, we start with because we assumed that if your cyber hygiene on the OT perspective is bad, then maybe your cyber hygiene on the IT perspective would be bad, and you'd be housing your industrial control system with some unsecured routers or some webcams or something else like that. The other reason would be if I was going to be manipulating some existing malware in order to interact with ICS devices, I would probably start with Mirai. I have the source code. It's excellent at scanning. It's demonstrated itself over and over again as being easy to manipulate and apply to a new domain. So it seemed like a good place to start. At the Cambridge Cybercrime Center, we monitor a /14 network. And we look at all the Mirai traffic coming in on that network because it's fairly easy to fingerprint. We look at about 150,000 unique hosts a day. And then I scanned back against all of those to see whether any of them had ICS protocol ports open. And the answer was basically no. Sort of a good result and a bad result, depending on which part of this you're trying to prove. We take that one step further, and we are looking at larger malware repositories. This is very much a work in progress. But again, we're saying the cybercrime community is really good at manipulating existing tools, not creating new tools. So what we're trying to look for is malware that has some knowledge of ICS. So it's really designed for something else, but maybe it understands that port 102 can be communicated with S7COM, or it understands the types of files that things like RxLogix or WinCC interact with. So maybe you're trying to manipulate something on a host device. That's very much a work in progress. We've been through about a couple hundred gigabytes of data, but obviously there's terabytes to look at here. The last one is hack forums. So the Cybercrime Center, Trend Micro does this. There are a couple of groups that basically find underground forums for cybercrime and electronic fraud and scrape all of the data off of those forums. So we have about 60 million posts from the last couple of years. And we use it to track lots of different electronic frauds. So for example, we were watching the distributed denial of service community, the booter community. We watched them fragment and then re-come together in a new location after the FBI hit the biggest booter services in the US in 2015. Similarly, we've been able to watch the rise of e-whoring. If you don't know what that is, I don't recommend looking it up. But it's a major fraudulent community. And what we've been able to show is by watching the forums, we can see people talking about moving from a very manual process for this fraudulent activity to a more automated process. And then that subsequently shows up in the wilds. And finally, we were able to track the movement of coinjacking or cryptojacking from Bitcoin over to ASIC-resistant coins. And the important thing about that is when you have ASIC-resistant cryptocurrencies, all of a sudden IoT botnets become a viable target for your cryptojacking, whereas they weren't before. So we were able to anticipate that shift just by watching these forums. So we thought if there's some nascent interest in this domain, maybe we're going to find it there. So we took a lot of things that we thought people might be looking up, and we find about 13,000 posts. But when you whittle this down, you get about 30 threads total. If you compare that against over 6,000 just tutorial threads for e-whoring, something most people haven't even heard of, this is a very slim pickings here. There's not very much. Now there are a couple of good Shodan tutorials amongst this community, but they're mainly there to find webcams with naked people on it. So not really ICS related. If you have your GitHub or Census or Shodan API keys on GitHub, people are probably scraping that. We do see two reasonable discussions on why ICS is so hard to secure, talking about the timelines that they're in the fields and the challenges associated with patching and long-term support. And then there's one guy who's selling physical access to smart meters. So that's kind of interesting in itself, but the actual financial activities there all happen through direct messaging, so we can't track any of that. So anyway, not very much. Not only is there not significant competence, but there doesn't even appear to be any significant interest. So the question is why? What is it about the things that we're missing that prevent this community from being interested in a population of 100,000 devices? And the first is, even though you have 100,000 devices, it's a very fragmented community, right? We have lots of manufacturers, we have proprietary software and hardware, and so overall, each individual part of that community is still way smaller than the overall IoT community, which makes IoT still more attractive. The second, and again, we saw lots of this yesterday, even if finding vulnerabilities is easy, it's quite difficult to exploit at scale, right? So PLC Blaster was a really good example of this, where finding the vulnerability was quick, but figuring out how to live off the land and then spread from device to device took very experienced, highly knowledgeable people, upwards of a year in order to figure that out. Then there's the unpredictability of the response. So if you're trying to live on the land, if you are trying to persist in a location because you're doing some kind of cryptojacking or you want to send spam from a device, you need to know how that device is going to behave with your malware so that you don't get detected, right? Your bread and butter is nobody finding you and the person whose device it is just being happy leaving you there for as long as possible. It's pretty easy in an IoT system because they're self-contained, right? A webcam is not going to have side effects on other devices around it. But with a PLC, that's actually much harder because all of your systems in which that PLC is installed is some kind of unique creation. So even if you can be confident the way a PLC is going to behave in one place, you really don't know how resource loaded it is or what other modules it has connected to it in another place, which makes that quite difficult. And finally, I would argue that this is quite hard to monetize, but we'll come back to that. So thankfully, there have been several presentations about Industry 4.0. And this desire to connect everything to software-defined networks, to basically get rid of anything in a system which is analog. You don't want to lay copper because it's expensive. You don't want to move copper because it's expensive. You want to be able to do what was the term in the last presentation? But basically, the goal is to have like a batch of one, right? You want the maximum customizability within your process, which to me sounds a lot like nonsense. But it's demonstrated on graphs like this, which you find at industry conferences and in academic literature. There's clouds around everything, right? And you have words like interface and services everywhere and customized production and wireless sensor nodes. And some of this is getting out there, right? Like this isn't just academic drivel. It is things that people are really trying to implement, particularly at the small to medium-sized business level, because that's the way they think that they're going to increase their profit margins. So what does this mean? This means a lot more connectable devices, at least, right? Lots more things that can be individually addressed on the internet. So we have a lot more devices, and then we also have some really key players who have bought off on this and are looking to win the war on homogeneity. So if we're going to increase the number of connectable devices by an order of magnitude, they want to own all of that, right? So this is Microsoft Azure Sphere, which I think is actually a really quality product. But look at the ways that they're talking about it. Use this with any device. If you're going to build something new, build it on top of Azure Sphere. If you have something already out there that's legacy, build a security device and put this in front of it, right? We want every device that you have in your industrial domain to have an Azure Sphere product either on top of it or underneath it. And they'll provide you the whole solution. They give you a chip, they give you an operating system, which is Linux-based, that they're going to support for 10 years. Or Huawei, when they're trying to do this, they've open sourced their LiDOS, for example. So now all of a sudden we're talking about commodity operating systems, highly resourced devices that are doing things that frankly don't require very much in the way of resources, right? Like a sensor, for example. And all of a sudden, some of these things start to change. So now, whereas before I had a lack of homogeneity, I have two major manufacturers that each want to have 500,000 devices in the next couple of years in this landscape, right? So you have homogeneity and a large population. The cost to develop and test, you can buy a dev board for like tens of dollars now, equivalent cost to IoT from a development perspective. You have all the resources you could possibly want. Some of these are still microcontrollers, but they're running MMUs. Like this is no longer flat address space. This is legitimate high power processors. They're running multiple ARM cores on them. They have lots of memory, everything you would expect in actually a current high-end embedded system. But we're going to put these things in our sensors that basically all it needs to do is a bit of A to D, right? No longer is it bespoke. Right? So we're not talking about bespoke things anymore. There's no more bare metal code. This is Linux running on top of an ARM core, which is fairly straightforward. And then that also gives you the other thing we talked about at the very beginning, which is somebody else doing all of your exploit development for you. So no longer do you need to get the PLC, spend all the time reverse engineering it. Somebody just hands you the source code for Mirai, and it works on this particular Linux branch that is running on Azure Sphere, and off you go. So we go from something like this to something which, frankly, I think looks a lot more like this. There's no indication that we're going to get any better at patching. Other people are handing us our exploits. And now we have a sufficiently resourced system that there is some opportunity to monetize here in a way that there wasn't before. So in summary, at the moment, I would say the risk is very low. But we're working quite hard to change that risk. We're producing good products, but we're actually starting to check all of the boxes that make this a very attractive population without changing the way that users actually make use of these devices. And that's it. I would really appreciate your feedback on this. A lot of this is a work in progress, so feel free to like throw the rotten fruit in my direction. I would appreciate that. Thank you.